Um, this session is on foreign policy and American and Chinese views, Japanese views of Chinese foreign policy. Obviously, this blends into security issues, and that's just a reality that we accept and will deal with. But we'll have four presenters. And I think I've forgotten the order. Are you first? Yeah. Professor Ayama is from Waseda University, has kindly agreed to lead off with the first presentation, and then we'll alternate. So please.
Okay. I cancel this one.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on a Friday. And my heartfelt thanks goes to Richard, Kevin, and the Brookings Institution for hosting this very important panel. I was rather late in submitting my talking points, so I cheated. I read all the others first, and then I realized that there were some issues that were not taken up by them. So my presentation really is focusing on the leftovers, as it were. And first, I wanted to introduce to you the debate over foreign policy that's continuing inside China. I'm trying to find the difference in views over these issues in Beijing. And for the last few years, many of you would know that there has been a debate over foreign policy, whether they should be more assertive or remain to be conciliatory in the basic line. Because these days, there are many people, increasing number of people, who would argue that Deng Xiaoping's line of the so-called Tao Guang Yang Hui, that is the low-profile conciliatory diplomacy, is out of date, because those were the lines, the policies that were crafted when China was weak, but now we are very powerful, so we have now the right to be more assertive. So in other words, 有所作为, achieving something should not be the main thing. We should be doing 奋发有为, that is to exert oneself. However, on the other hand, there are people who still argue that we must stick to Deng Xiaoping's line because China, after all, is still a developing country, and we do thrive in the current international orders. And also, we must not lose our good image. Where is Xi Jinping? Xi Jinping is trying to be more on the former side, I would say. Exerting oneself, 奋发有为, seems to be the catchphrase recently. Related debate, there's one over the China model of development, 中国模式, who, there are, particularly after 2008, the world financial crisis, when some Chinese saw that the decline of the United States had begun. So the American model and the Washington consensus, they are shattered. And the era of the China model, the Chinese way of development, is to lead the world. That kind of an argument emerged very powerfully inside China. And these people tend to deny the existence of universal values. There has always also been a very important debate over the existence or non-existence of universal values. And these days there are more nationalistic people who would argue that there are no such thing as universal values. There are only Western values. I mean, they're talking about values such as human rights and democracy. And the Western people are imposing these values on us by calling them universal values. But on the other hand, there are reformers in China who would argue that, no, the China model is now obsolete, as it were, because without privatization, liberalization, and distributive reforms, and if they don't come soon, China will be in deep trouble. And we should accept universal values as former leaders like Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao did. Where does Xi Jinping stand in these debates? I would say he is an economic reformer in the sense that he promotes liberalization, deregularization, and so on, although in my point of view, he hasn't really tackled the core part of the system, such as SOEs, distribution, central-local relations. And you remember Wen Jiabao arguing very forcefully that in order to do these reforms, implement these reforms, political reform is necessary to crush the opposition against these substantial reforms. But Xi Jinping does not accept universal values, and that worries me a lot. Right. In this context, what happened in this part of the world, in the East Asian theater, is that the US adopted the pivot policy or the rebalancing policy. And the response to the US pivot or the US rebalancing has been twofold, in my view. On the one hand, China has returned to the low-profile diplomacy as far as its policy towards the US is concerned. And Xi Jinping has been promoting the new major power relationship. So that's one kind of a response that came. But secondly, China also heightened alert against the containment and encirclement that many of them see in the US and the Japanese policies. So in the words of one Chinese colonel, US is a global tiger while Japan is an Asian wolf. Now, it was in this context that the Senkaku issue arose between Japan and China. And when you remember the 2010 trawler collision incident, when the Chinese trawler rammed into Japanese Coast Guard vessels, and 2 years later, in 2012, the Japanese government decided to purchase 3 of the 5 major islands around the Senkakus, and the Chinese reacted very forcefully against that. However, when the Chinese were about to make a decision how to respond to the Japanese government's purchase, there were actually 2 different views in Beijing. The hardliners argued that the Japanese act of purchasing the islands was open provocation and challenge to their sovereignty. However, there were moderate views also. There were moderates who argued that Japan's act was not to provoke, but rather to cool things down, because the Tokyo governor Ishihara had made the provocation because he had declared that if the Tokyo metropolitan government bought the islands, he would be making ports and station civil servants and so on and so forth, and the Japanese government was trying to prevent those things from happening, and it had nothing to do with sovereignty anyway. However, we all know the result of the debate. The hardliners won, and in the fierce demonstrations against Japan that happened in many, many cities in 2012, we could not but recognize the affinity between neo-Maoist or leftist thinking and chauvinism or xenophobia. As you see in the picture, the anti-Japanese demonstrators, many of them were carrying the picture of Mao Zedong. And also, this was mentioned in the earlier session too, but the Chinese Communist Party has adopted this traditional method to unite the party and unite the nation by setting up a foreign enemy, as it were. We could all sense very easily that Japan had become an easy target of this operation, this very classic operation. We recall that the incident happened just before the party congress. Party congress was held in November. The incident happened in September, and it was a very delicate time for the Chinese politicians at that time. No one was able to look soft towards Japan. So there were fierce demonstrations, and the reaction to the Japanese purchase was very sharp. Now, in this context, I've been living in Beijing actually for the past 5 months, and I cannot but recognize this deep gap between Japanese perception, the perception held by the Japanese about Japan-China relations, and how the Chinese see all sorts of issues in the Japan-China relationship. And I find the information gap between the two countries very serious. We have to do something to close this gap. I'll give you one example. When the trawler collision incident happened in September 2010, you see the picture here. This is a drawing that appeared in Xinhua one day after the incident. And I was very surprised when I found this, because how did they know that this is what happened? They were not able to interview the captain. I don't think any Chinese boat was close to the collision site. Then it became clear that this was a sheer political fabrication because of the leaked video. One official of the Japanese Coast Guard breached the regulations and issued this video that was taken by the Japanese Coast Guards. If you're interested, you can visit the site and see for yourself what actually happened. But that's the kind of information this is the kind of information that the Chinese ordinary people and the Chinese ordinary cadres have access to. So I am deeply concerned about this gap. Another example is, let's take up the case of Prime Minister Abe's visit to the Yasukuni Shrine in December 2013, very controversial. And the prevalent Chinese view is that Prime Minister Abe went to arouse nationalistic sentiments, to unite the nation and increase his popularity. However, was this the case? I don't really think so. Because according to the polls that were taken immediately after the visit, let's take up the one that was conducted by Asahi Shimbun. The result was that 41% of the Japanese population thought it was good that he went, but 46% thought that he should not have gone there. But it's Asahi. So, you know, some people may question the result of the polls, but what about Sankei then, on the other side of the political spectrum? And, excuse me, the Sankei Fuji network Fuji is the name of the television channel controlled by Sankei Shimbun. According to their poll, the result was even, the line was similar to Asahi, but the percentage was like this. 38% of the Japanese population positively praised it, while 53% did not. So it was quite clear that the Japanese views on his visit was divided, and by going, he was not uniting the nation, but he was actually dividing the Japanese nation. So the level of nationalism is very different in China and in Japan, but this is not well understood by the Chinese because there have been so many pieces of information that Japanese nationalism is running very high. Mr. Abe is being successful in arousing nationalist sentiments among the Japanese. You know, this information gap is so large. I'm running out of time. I must hurry. One characteristic of Chinese foreign policy, or external policy for that matter, is that the words that have been said by Xi Jinping has been very soft or gentle, but the actual action, the deeds have been rather tough and hardline. For example, in the peripheral diplomacy workshop, so-called, in October 2013, a very conciliatory policy line was presented, and Xi Jinping himself added 4 Chinese characters upon the conciliatory traditional policy line towards the neighbors. That's intimacy, sincerity, benefit, and tolerance. All very good, very fine. And also, in the same month, he went to Jakarta and said that with regard to differences and disputes between China and some Southeast Asian nations on territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests, peaceful solutions should be sought, and differences and disputes should be properly handled through equal-footed dialogue and friendly consultation in the overall interests of bilateral ties and regional stability. Fantastic. But what are the deeds? Deeds were very different. November 2013, the announcement of ADIS. May 2014, deployment of the oil rig near the parasols, and the land reclamation. We've heard somewhat about that in the earlier session. Intrusion by Chinese patrol boats into the Senkaku territorial waters continues to this day, and the air miss between Japanese and Chinese military planes happened twice, not only once, but twice in May and June last year. And we cannot but notice one thing is that whenever the Chinese bring up the history card, it often is the case that they are trying to justify their deeds. I once had a conversation with this very senior theoretician in China I asked him, well, your idea about peaceful development is fantastic, but doesn't it contradict with the sending of patrol boats to the territorial waters around the Senkakus? And he fell silent for a few moments. And then after that, he blasted out all his criticisms about what Japan did during the war. And finally criticized me for having a wrong recognition of his history, but I had not touched history at all. So it made me realize that the grudges are deep on the one hand, but on the other hand, they seem to be using the history card whenever they wanted to justify their deeds. All right, and coming close to the end of my presentation, why are there gaps? Why are these gaps in what they say and what they do? One explanation is that there is lack of coordination, which is a perennial problem in Chinese bureaucracy. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs tend to be conciliatory, while the propaganda department tend to be nationalistic and more leftist in their orientation. PLA and the old department tend to act first and secure interests and create faits accompli. And finally, I think the important question is, what do the Chinese want? What are the intentions of the Chinese? And I see some conflicting targets here. The first one, the immediate target is to unite the party and the nation. So the tussle with the neighbors here proves very useful. That's what happened in September 2012, I presume. However, peace and prosperity is also important for the Chinese Communist Party. And in this sense, of course, cooperation with the neighbors, particularly with Japan, is useful and necessary. However, in the long run, if they are aiming to establish control in the near seas, in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, and the Western Pacific, that will cause a big problem for us all. And the Chinese idea is that they can achieve this, hopefully, without fighting. They quote Sun Tzu, his masterpiece of The Art of War. So by creating a huge presence in the South China Sea, for example, they can achieve their aims, their targets, without actual fighting. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm David Shambaugh from George Washington University and Brookings. I guess we were introduced previously, sorry. But we've been given a broad menu of topics for discussion on this second foreign policy panel. Our organizers asked us to address questions such as China's grand strategy, domestic sources of China's external policies, China's overall global foreign relations, its regional relations in Asia, and its approaches to international order. So lots, big menu. I'm not going to do any of those things. I'm going to focus I'm going to zero in on three elements of China's approach to its foreign policy to try and, maybe I guess this falls under the domestic sources, but part of it falls under the approaches to global order. So I'd like to address three subjects. First, China's global identities. Secondly, its approaches to global order. And thirdly, its public diplomacy abroad. So concerning the first, China's global identities, some of what I'll have to say echoes what you just heard from Takahara-san. I'd like to argue that China is a very conflicted and ambivalent country about its global identity and roles in the world. It's having something of, I think, a pretty serious international identity crisis. And that identity crisis is reflected in the ongoing debates that Professor Takahara just described for you. These debates have been ongoing really since about 2008, I would argue. They've been very animated, very contested, and they're far from over. And the Chinese who participate in these debates are asking questions, pretty fundamental questions, like who are we in the world? What are our main national interests? What do we stand for? Who are our real friends and enemies? And how to avoid entrapment in other nations' foreign policies, particularly the United States. So these debates are ongoing. And one way of thinking about them is, let's see here, No, this is a different presentation. So, this is Takahara-san's. Let me see if mine was not preloaded here. Okay. So, where they would be loaded? Right. Okay. So F5 usually gets us. Whoop. How do we get? Can you just show the big slide? Not all these. Okay. All right. Well, I don't want to take time to go through this. You can kind of see for yourself. There are, in my view, at least 6, 7 different schools of thought that are participating in this debate, and they fall along a spectrum from what I call the nativists on one end to the globalists on the other. Nativists are those who argue for a closed, autarkic, insular, disengaged, and unengaged China. Globalists are what you might call the Anne-Marie Slaughters of China, very engaged, even liberal. And in between, there are a variety of other schools of thought and voices articulated. So that spectrum also can be thought of in terms of what does it mean for the United States? Where do these different schools of thought fall relative to American policies and priorities? And you can see the way that I at least kind of try and illustrate that on a kind of pro and anti-US and an active versus passive diplomatic posture. So if anything, it shows that China's conflicted and doesn't have a singular policy. Sometimes, and so we see this manifest in China's foreign relations around the world. Sometimes we see China's leaders sitting at what you might call the high table of intergovernmental gatherings, G20, UN, so on, acting as global power brokers and playing a pragmatic role as an engaged and seemingly responsible power. Other times the world hears belligerent rhetoric from official Chinese foreign ministry spokesmen and from cyber nationalists. Sometimes China bullies its neighbors over conflicting territorial claims or acts even in what you might call neo-imperialist fashion by exploiting natural resources in faraway continents. Elsewhere in the world, we see China pragmatically striking trade deals and other agreements with its global network of so-called strategic partners. So you have a contradictory China, I would argue, on the world stage, not a singular China. And the bottom line is anybody who's sort of looking for consistency in Chinese foreign policy, you're not going to find it. We find a number of different contradictory and inconsistent behaviors. This should not be surprising. China's wrestling with pressures and opportunities, you might say, that it never has before on a truly global basis. Moreover, I don't think we should be deceived by slogans. China, and we've just heard from Professor Takahara, China puts a high priority on what I call Kohao Waijiao, slogan diplomacies, words, 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 rhetoric, rhetoric, rhetoric. And it's very easy for us as observers to focus on those words and that rhetoric and try and parse them and figure out what they mean and link them to certain institutional groups inside the country. It's a lot of illusion, I would argue. We would do much better focusing on Chinese behavior in its region and in the world, and not so much on these kind of rhetorical debates and chungyus that come out of the leadership's mouth. So that's the first thing. China is a conflicted power on the world stage, I argue, because it has a conflicted identity. It doesn't know who it is and what it wants. So that leads directly to the second subject I want to discuss briefly. What kind of global order does China seek? And what role does it see for itself in that order? And here too, unsurprisingly, we, or at least I, see a very uncertain and conflicted China. Does it believe in upholding the post-World War II order, an order which they are always quick to remind us they were not part of the creation of, at least the People's Republic of China was not, the Republic of China was? Or does China seek to alter or even overturn that order? Personally, I think China's deeply dissatisfied, always has been, with the post-war liberal order on a normative basis. But it has not challenged that order since the early 1970s. Remember, in the 50s and 60s, it definitely did. But since the 70s, it hasn't, largely because it has been able to extract considerable resources from that order. It's been a pragmatic and tactical decision, in other words, to participate in the post-war liberal order. But now that the resources are not in as great supply, China's far more developed, we're seeing a more revisionist China emerge. One where the discontent and dissatisfaction is beginning to show itself again. It doesn't mean China's seeking to overthrow the entire order. There are parts of the order, I would argue, the economic order, in which it is very satisfied on the whole. The security order it's never been satisfied with and is seeking to revise and overturn, I would argue. The social order, human rights, and a whole social basket of issues, it's more ambivalent about and decides to kind of opt out of. And then other global governance issues they take on a case-by-case basis. So we have, again, a kind of conflicted China. It doesn't act with one view because it doesn't really have one view of what it wants in world affairs. It knows what it doesn't want. It knows what it's against, but it doesn't know what it's really for. And that is manifest, I think, in its behavior in multilateral institutions. It has a strong normative preference for South-South relations, empowering developing countries' voice more in world affairs. It cares very much, really, about the participation of countries rather than the content of the policies that are decided by multilateral institutions. And it has, I think, very deep-seated grievances against the West, and particularly the United States. Professor Takahara just mentioned Taoguang Hui. Well, I think Taoguang Hui is still very much an operative approach by China towards the United States. And I essentially see Beijing's approach to Sino-American relations as a tactical one of temporizing, freezing, you might even say, the United States. While it maneuvers actively all over the globe and the region in Asia to try and build its own relationships for its own ends. So the best they can hope for, they don't want to oppose the United States, but they want to freeze the United States while they do all these other things, Yosuo Zouwei, everywhere else. So China, or at least the Chinese government, neither trusts nor likes the United States. And we, Americans, should not be deceived by that. And we should not be taken in by the rhetoric of building new type of great power relations or whatever the slogan of the week happens to be. We need to search for tangible areas of cooperation where we can with the Chinese government, where our interests overlap and where we can actually work together. At the same time, we have to recognize that competition, strategic competition, is inevitable, it's natural, it's not surprising, it's entirely normal in major power relations like this. The trick, or the task, the responsibility, I should say, is to manage that competition without it bleeding further towards a full adversarial relationship. So global order is one area where the US and China can and should work together, but that requires a more activist and engaged and confident China. And I don't see China as either activist, engaged, or confident in terms of global governance. So we Americans have difficulty finding a partner on global governance in China. Thirdly, the third issue, let me just briefly come to, is that of China's global image and public diplomacy. It's a big and complicated subject in itself, but let me give you a couple of slides that will try and summarize my points. I mean, these are from the BBC Global Attitude Survey. BBC and Pew are the two major surveys that one turns to for this kind of indication. So we see China right next to the United States in the middle. The world has, in other words, very mixed views of China, neither overwhelmingly positive nor overwhelmingly negative. They're just mixed. They're slightly more positive than they are negative, but they're basically mixed. Moreover, though, if you look at these polls over time, from 2005 until last year, China is the yellow line, top yellow line, you will see a rather precipitous secular decline over time, with the exception of a spike in 2011 that I can't explain. But over time, China has dropped 12 points amongst these countries that were polled. So China's global image is A, mixed, and B, declining. And why is this important? Well, if a nation's to be a global power, image matters. And the Chinese government has woken up to that fact around about the year 2008. And to its surprise, it finds that its image around the world is mixed and not particularly good. There are some, what you might call, pockets of favorability in some parts of the world, and there are pockets of negativity in other parts of the world. And then there's the big center of ambiguity, you might say. Even in areas of the world where you might expect China to have pockets of favorability, namely the developing world of Africa and Latin America and the Middle East, you don't find it. This is the Pew Global Attitudes Survey on soft power issues, and they ask, a dozen countries along the left-hand side about Chinese music, movies, and television, and then Chinese ideas and customs. And overwhelmingly, all these African and Latin countries see Chinese customs not positively. So soft power, where you would expect it to resonate in the developing world, it's not. Okay? So that's of even greater concern to the Chinese government. So they are throwing billions of dollars at this. We don't know exactly, but the estimates are somewhere in the 12 to 15 billion per year range into a wide variety of activities to try and improve its image around the world and increase its so-called soft power. But they're doing this in a way like they build infrastructure and high-speed rail. They throw money at it and expect it to develop. That's not the way soft power develops. You earn soft power. You don't buy soft power. They seem to wish, I would argue, that there was sort of a Walmart they can go to and go down the culture aisle and buy an off-the-shelf kit of soft power kit. Not so easy. You can't just buy it. So time will tell if China's soft power and global image improves. This is still rather recent. 2008 is when they began to pay attention to and invest in this. So far, they do not see return on their investment, okay? But that's only 7 years. We'll have to wait a little bit longer. The basic point, let me conclude on this, is that to possess soft power, a nation needs to have values and elements of its society and system that have universality and appeal, that both attract others like a magnet and travel outside their own society and appeal, as I say, to others. This is precisely China's problem. China's culture and system are sui generis, which means unique. And they don't travel very well. They don't have much appeal. They don't attract others to them. Therefore, to connect this last dimension to the previous two, global order and global identity, China's uniqueness, in my view, is precisely the reason it is so conflicted. And Chinese exceptionalism, if you will, is not going to make China a global power. China needs to find, if it can, some elements of its culture and its society and what it stands for in the world that do appeal beyond its borders, and stop asking, why are we unique? 中国特色, special characteristics of China. That's not going to help. So long and short of my presentation is that we're dealing here with a conflicted country that does not have a very clear sense of itself, and therefore what behavior we're seeing on the international stage and the regional stage is a manifestation of that. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Rumi Aoyama from Waseda University, and it's my great pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity of sharing my views with you. Today, I'm going to be talking about China's re-emergence in its foreign policy. I'm sure many of you here are very familiar with recent China's international behavior. On his trip to the United States, President Xi Jinping called for a new type of great power relationship as a framework for future bilateral relations. And tensions are mounting between China and its neighboring countries, especially with the Philippines, Vietnam, and Japan. And China has played a major role in launching initiatives to increase infrastructure financing for developing countries, and it has also taken the initiative to establish 2 banks and 1 fund. That is the British New Development Bank, the AIIB, and the Silk Road Foundation. But these moves on the part of Beijing has raised questions such as, well, is China become more and more assertive? Does China has a desire to overturn the existing international order? Is there any tensions between its foreign policy and defense strategy? Is there any differences between its approach to the Asian region and approach to major powers outside of China? Well, I think all these questions are very difficult to answer, but it may help if we put the behavior in context. In my view, there are 4 fundamental goals of China's foreign policy. First is to create a favorable international environment. That is, why China needs to establish a stable relationship with the United States, and in the meantime, to maintain a stable peripheral environment. Second is to defend China's core interests. Well, actually, the concept of core interests is very vague in China, but I think it at least possesses 3 elements: China's territory at land and sea, Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang. Third is to maintain political and social stability and to keep the momentum of economic growth. 4 is to re-emerge as a superpower. You can see all these 4 goals are very complicated and it's very difficult to achieve. But I think the Chinese government is trying very hard to achieve all these goals at the same time. So that is why sometimes the Chinese foreign policy may seem very contradictory. Then I will move on to talk about China's the continuity and changes in China's foreign policy. Nowadays, the Chinese government had mentioned a lot about the new Silk Road strategy, and which is also referred as China's Marshall Plan. Well, but in fact, if you look at the China's foreign policy very closely, you can find that the new Silk Road strategy is not especially a new policy. Maybe it's just the new wine in an old bottle. And I think the new Silk Road by launching the new Silk Road strategy, China seeks to expand its influence in Asia and to boost its economy by connecting with other Asian countries. So you can see it's not new. We can see the basic line in China's Asia policy starting from the early 1990s. Well, in China, 周边外交 policy towards its surrounding countries is more frequently used than 亚洲外交 Asia policy. And the surrounding countries possess 3 geopolitical definitions. The narrowest definition refers to China's immediate neighbor. And what about the broadest definition? Well, according to the Chinese edits, countries from the western part of the Persian Gulf to the eastern end of the South Pacific region, comprise the group with the broadest definition. So interestingly, but not by no means coincidentally, the geopolitical range of the New Silk Road strategy coordinate with the broadest definition of China's Asia policy. That is why I'm saying that that China's New Silk Road strategy is just a new slogan for China's Asia policy and a new term for West China Development Program. And we can see a very strong continuity in China's foreign policy in the past 2 decades. But on the other hand, we can see distinctive changes can also be observed in China's foreign policy. Well, actually, in my view, I think China made its biggest foreign policy adjustment in the year of 2006. For almost 30 years, economic development has been the ultimate goal of China's foreign policy. But in the year of 2006, China redefined its national interests. And since then, in addition to economic development, sovereignty and security are also explicitly mentioned as the ultimate goal of this foreign policy. But in my opinion, I think this has been the biggest foreign policy shift in Beijing since the adoption of the open door policy in 1978. And this change may be triggered by UNCLOS. According to UNCLOS, May 2009 was the deadline for all claimants to submit their claims. So that's why China redefined its national interest and in the year of 2006. And second change in China's foreign policy is I called as China's pivot to the West and South. During fall 2011, the U.S. has announced the pivot to Asia policy. I know that it's not a new policy for the United States, but in the eyes of the Chinese government and most of the elite, this is a strategy of containment aimed at preventing China's re-emergence. So faced with the challenge from its east, China adopted a new strategy that can be termed as pivot to West and South. While this strategy, which is also called as the New Silk Road strategy, aims to strengthen its relations with the countries in the West and South, including including Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. After looking at the recent China's international behavior, we can see that there are several salient features of current China's foreign policy. The first one is the engagement and militarism in China's foreign policy. And I think we are all very familiar with China's engagement policy in Asia. But in the meantime, China has also actively engaged with all the regional institutions in the world, well, in order to increase its political influence globally. You can see there's the bilateral dialogue established by China and other regional institutions like China CEE, Central Eastern Europe Summit, China Arab States Cooperation Forum, China GCC Strategic Dialogue, Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Well, not all the countries in the region can be categorized as developing countries, but in China, nevertheless, well, the countries in these regions are categorized as the developing countries. So, in order to counter the influence of Western countries and to emerge as a global power, China tries to align itself with BRICS countries and the developing countries. As a result, there's a re-emergence of South-South cooperation principle in China's foreign policy. And in the meantime, we can see that China will make no compromise on territorial issues. Okay, I'll stop here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I've organized my presentation around 5 questions that I think are really being hotly debated about Chinese foreign policy. And I'll try to pick up on some of the things perhaps that some of our other speakers haven't said or that I might disagree with. So the first question is, does China have a grand strategy? And if so, what is it? And I think this is, there's a lot of discussion about what China's grand strategy is. Some people believe that China is trying to achieve global primacy, to supplant the United States. There are others who think that China is seeking to push the United States out of the Pacific to implement its own Monroe Doctrine. I myself think that China really isn't quite that ambitious yet, but I think that China's strategy, I actually really take Xi Jinping's statements at face value, that the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, the achievement of the China dream, as it's called, returning China to greatness is really China's grand strategy. So foreign policy, of course, is still aimed at shaping an international environment that's favorable to this goal. But as David Shambaugh talked about, there are so many contradictions within Chinese foreign policy. And there are different national interests and objectives that China is trying to achieve. So foreign policy has to serve the domestic objective of sustainable economic growth, of forging national unity, of promoting loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party, defending Chinese sovereignty, obtaining energy supplies, persuading other nations to not take steps that would damage Chinese interest, and preventing the formation overall of an anti-China coalition. So there's these many conflicting objectives that China has in its foreign policy. So the second question, which has been touched on by others, is China's foreign policy today reactive or proactive? And I would say it is both. The trend is toward increasingly proactive. And I think we've seen many examples of this in recent years. Analysts concentrated in 2010 on some of the provocative moves that were taken that the Chinese called provocative by Japan when Japan arrested the Chinese fishing boat and detained the fishing captain for a prolonged period, or in 2012 when the Philippines had moved a warship into Scarborough Shoal to arrest Chinese fishermen. And of course, we see more recently the Air Defense Identification Zone in the East China Sea, the positioning of the oil rig off the coast of the Paracels in Vietnam's waters. Just a few examples of more, I think, sort of proactive actions. I think it's important, again, to note, as Takahara-san has, that Xi Jinping is very explicitly calling for China to be more proactive. That Feng Fai Your Wei, I think, has actually only been used once. There are different formulations in Chinese, but they really all mean be more proactive. And of course, Xi Jinping at the Foreign Affairs Work Conference last year explicitly encouraged China to adopt great power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. So the third question, which also David addressed, is what are China's goals for the international order? And this is also being hotly debated. Again, China has long pushed for a more, what it calls, fair and just international order. And now that China has more influence and power, I think it is begun.
Nigeria, Kenya and Senegal. Could you explain that a little bit?
David, thanks for asking a short question.
Sure.
And a question.
You're right. It wasn't uniformly that all 12 countries or 14 countries had predominantly negative. There were those three, I guess. And the answer to your
the Beijing portion of it, because we have yet to know what Tsai Ing-wen's positions will be. But it's an interactive dynamic. I'm somewhat concerned by the fact that Xi Jinping, in his first meeting with the former official from Taiwan, did emphasize that differences between the two sides of the strait shouldn't be set aside forever. And I think that does represent his personal view, and so that means that he is somewhat impatient. My second concern is that Xi Jinping undoubtedly faces some pressure and opposition for some of his policies at home, whether they be the anti-corruption campaign or some of the reforms that he wants to implement. So there will be people who are critics who are looking for opportunities to weaken him. And so this is an issue on which he could be vulnerable. And so if there are perceived to be some challenges from a new leader in Taiwan who doesn't embrace what the 1992 consensus that Beijing wants it to embrace, then there could be great pressures for the mainland to take a tougher line and to reevaluate what has been an assumption in its policy that by providing economic benefits to Taiwan, that this would ultimately lead to better political relations and ultimately integration. So this is, we really, I think, we have to understand these dynamics on the mainland that could influence policy.
Anybody else? This is the report.
Oh, thank you. He's advertising for me.
Well, it's worth advertising. It is really good. I had the privilege of reviewing it in draft form, and it was good then, and I'm sure it's a lot better now. Not because of me, just because the authors are very good. But it's a really important inventory of what is going on in an important area, and the picture isn't pretty. The gentleman towards the back. Yes, sir.
Yoshi Komori of the Sankei Shimbun, and I have a question for Professor Takahara. You showed the what you call the information gap between so-called hardliners' pronouncements and what the moderates say, both on the developments in Japan. And then you pretty much stated that very often what the hardliners state are not consistent with the facts. And I think it's clear in the case of Chinese fishing boats collision with the Japanese Coast Guard patrol boat. But my question is, if unfortunately those hardliners' position becomes more often than not is official Chinese government claim or protest, but if you just look at the facts, sometimes it's easy to prove that what the hardliners are saying is not really consistent with the facts. But my question is, what's your understanding of so-called hardliners' grasp of the factual situation in Japan? Don't they know really what the real facts are, and yet they might say what they have to say, or they are simply ignorant sometimes? No? What's your view on that?
I am gravely concerned about the information flow inside the party, whether the Xinhua and other related media agencies are reporting the truth about incidents or whatever that's happening outside of China. I have friends in the Chinese media who complain that they have to write things that they don't really want to because they know that they're not the facts. But that's the way the propaganda machine is at work now. So I'm gravely worried that Xi Jinping may not be getting the correct information about Japan, about the United States, about Vietnam. So this, I think, is a very serious problem. So it's not only the public that do not know correctly what's going on, but what about the top leadership? The top leaders, are they really getting facts? This is a very worrisome situation, I must say.
Anybody else want to comment on this? Don't get me going on how China is interpreting what has happened in Hong Kong, because I think we see the same problem. And the consequence of it is that Chinese leaders don't always understand that what they see happening that they find as threatening is the result of their own policies. And but we could have a whole conference on that. I think we're about out of time, so I'd like to spend just a couple minutes summing up. I think what we've found is in both the first panel and second panel is that, you know, there are some differences on specific points. But what I think we see is between Japanese and American China scholars is a difference in emphasis, not a difference in basic outlook. And that's interesting, that's good. We can continue to talk about where we have the difference in emphasis and what the basis of it is. But I think that's the first takeaway. I think, second of all, that this difference in emphasis is not surprising for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that China's external policy is is based on a variety of instruments of comprehensive national power. And I sometimes compare it to a symphony orchestra, that you have the string section. And this is the part of the Chinese system that does the slogan diplomacy in David's term. And then you have the drums and the horns, very loud, very striking. And sometimes the drums and the horns come in while the violins are playing and create great confusion, including for the players of the drums, the horns, and the violins, and the conductor. And so, you know, some of us emphasize the violins and some of us emphasize the drums and the horns, but, you know, that's to be expected. The second reason for this difference in emphasis is that both our countries are pluralistic, and as Bonnie suggested, there are debates that go on in both our countries about all of these issues. And I'll confess that we picked people from both the American China watching community and the Japanese watching community, who I think we can say are in the mainstream. And I think there was a good reason for doing that. But there's some people outside the mainstream. One person on the American side has already been mentioned. The way in which the China watching community in each country view China is going to be a little bit more varied than what we've represented here. But I think that this really does form an important baseline for our understanding of how our two countries view what, as I said at the outset, is probably the biggest challenge to our alliance and will be for a long time to come. So please join me in expressing your appreciation to all the panelists. Thank you for your great questions. So the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.